Hi, everyone. Welcome to our deep dive into higher education and student affairs in disability services. Today, joined with me is Alex Mazzeo from USC Disability Services. I will go ahead and read his bio as well as address some housekeeping items, and then we'll get right to it. So as you can see, please scan the QR code as well as share your cameras, if you can. The format for today's event will consist of me asking a few structured questions and then opening it up to a Q&A from the audience. We encourage you all to ask questions, whether it's in the chat or on camera. If you'd like to raise your virtual hand, that would be great. Also, if you have questions about the workshop, please feel free to just ask them. It's kind of a more informal setup. So with that said, I will go ahead and read Alex's bio, and Alex, you'll have about 8 to 10 minutes to talk about your career journey, and then we'll ask our questions. So here we go. Alex began his educational journey at the University of Florida, where he earned his BS in psychology and MED in student personnel and higher education. While finishing his master's degree, Alex served as the graduate community coordinator in the Department of Housing and Resident Education and completed his practicum internship in the Disability Resource Center. At the DRC, he directly supported outreach and student programming efforts to promote disability as a valued aspect of diversity. He went on to serve as an exam accommodations coordinator at UC Santa Cruz, then a disability specialist at UCLA. Currently, Alex serves as a lead specialist for clinical and professional programs at USC's Office of Student Accessibility Services, where he specializes in determining didactic and external work placement accommodations for graduate students with disabilities. Alex is passionate about student development, educational equity, and social justice, and strives to incorporate these values into his everyday practice. Alex, take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel, for having me here, and thanks everyone for joining during your lunch hour. So, like Isabel said, my name is Alex Mazzeo. I use he/him, his pronouns, and just to start off and talk a little bit about my journey into disability services, but more broadly my journey into student affairs. Um, I think like many folks within student life. I sort of stumbled upon this career through a lot of campus organizations and student activities that I participated in as an undergrad student. So I got my first career started off as a resident assistant while I was an undergrad student, and was actually on a trajectory to pursue uh, actually dental school, which was drastically different from what I ended up pursuing, but knew, through that experience that I really was enjoying more so the student facing part of my work and the opportunity to really, participate in kind of the development and mentorship of students within colleges. And that really opened me up to, you know, participation in a number of different, functional areas within student life. So I worked within housing and residence life. I spent some time in orientation services, working at a student union. And then also, worked within diversity and equity programming, both in my, undergrad education, but also, continuing in grad schools as well. And I think in doing so, that was where I really was brought into the field of disability services. And so, within the Office of Student Accessibility Services, we exist, in part because of really seminal legislation such as the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. But the way that the field was really introduced to me was more through social models of disability and really reevaluating and kind of recontextualizing how we were, interacting not only with academic environments, but just environments as a whole. And, through that, I started getting involved with student programming as a grad student. So we put on programs such as programs within like Disability Awareness Month, and really trying to bring light to services and some of the gaps that we were noticing in university settings. So areas where folks were struggling or necessarily didn't have equal access in those settings. And so that brought me to actually when I was graduating was at the same time as the pandemic was starting to occur. So with that, I ended up going more into exam coordination for students in remote settings and worked briefly at UC Santa Cruz. But I think still found within that role that I was really craving more student interaction, more discussions around, development, and also, making sure students were aware of, their rights within higher education, especially with regard to receiving accommodations and accessing them either as, an undergrad or graduate student. And at UCLA, I worked as a disability specialist. So there I was, really interfacing closely with students and helping to determine academic accommodations, but also had the really unique opportunity to really collaborate with campus partners across campus. I was able to, I think, really interface with kind of a wide variety of not only student life offices, but also academic departments. And I think that's something that is unique about disability services. We kind of have a hand in every hat, so to speak, just because within accessibility and within departments, our office is really tasked with understanding where there might be institutional policies or practices where an accessibility barrier is created, and how can we necessarily support access in that setting if that's requesting an exception to a policy or really interacting in a way that's going to we say really ensure a level playing field for folks. And so my experiences at UCLA really actually brought me to USC, where I was interfacing a lot with students in graduate programs, specifically graduate programs that had some level of a practicum internship or a like external work placement where they were not only getting sort of that didactic experience of being in the classroom and engaging with concepts and theory, but also had this really on-ground experience where they were interacting with a site supervisor, interacting with folks in that particular setting, and so that's actually what I'm doing now at USC. So I work with all students on campus, but I would say I have a particular affinity for working with graduate students, whether that be grad students in master's level programs, PhD or EDD programs, as well as the professional schools. So our School of Occupational Therapy, School of Dentistry, School of Medicine. And so we again explore accommodations across those settings. And so I think in looking back at my career trajectory and some of I would say the common themes I've identified, across time, and I think I had mentioned in my bio were, really a particular affinity for spaces where we're centering social justice, educational equity, but also in student development. I think within the field of disability services, while we are a compliance office and while we are determining services for students, I think when we're interfacing with folks and when folks are getting connected with our office, there can be, I would say, a lot that comes within that, I would say, specialist to student relationship. Some students may have had a long history of receiving supports within early education, whether that be through a 504 plan or an individualized education plan that they received in K through 12. Whereas some folks, and what we see specifically a lot with psychological disabilities is that a lot of folks are diagnosed between the ages of around 18 to 24. And so for a lot of folks who are interfacing with our office, it may be the first time they're kind of seeing some of their academic challenges within that lens. And so we're there to, walk them through, services, but also other supports on campus where we're really, I would say, partnered and connected with many facets of campus life to make sure folks have support from an accessibility lens, but also from a well-being lens. I think those two pieces are very intertwined in our work. So that I think summarizes just some of my career trajectory, and I think across many areas I've had experience with, program assessment, training, DEI education, and I think consistently, it's brought me back to spaces where especially accessibility is at the forefront, and we're really learning and dissecting, different academic settings and how we can really work, not just within our office, but from a campus-wide level, how we can make accessibility a priority and continue to really pioneer access for students at USC.
That was very helpful and insightful. Thank you, Alex. Can you tell us what a typical day in your role looks like and what a non-typical day looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think on a typical day within our role, in coming to the office, most of my work is, meeting with students to discuss academic accommodations. And so this can be with, students who are new to our office or also, returning students as well. So, much of my time is spent either, in person or over the phone or Zoom, speaking with students and really assessing really different, I would say, academic settings in USC. So looking at, when folks are taking a timed exam or when folks are participating in the classroom, or even when, we're reading textbooks at home or engaging with work kind of outside the traditional classroom setting, really understanding where there might be barriers there, and discussing potential supports or accommodations that would really, we say, kind of help in mitigating that barrier or really leveling the playing field for folks. Um, and so I think stemming from those meetings, a lot of times we're also working with faculty and departments to coordinate services. So, in the event, for example, of a temporary entry, for example, if a student has a concussion or breaks their arm, for example, we might be coordinating with faculty or departments to help coordinate more specific services, if that's furniture in the classroom, if that's, thinking about even just like elevator access on campus and where to find entry points. And so that's where we're really collaborating across the campus and looking at, um, you know, how our partners are really key in kind of that conversation around accessibility. And then, of course, I think this is probably pretty typical of many roles, is just some of the more administrative pieces to our work. So following up with emails, contacting folks, and really just, I think, broadly campus outreach to help with making folks aware of our services. Um, I would say like a non-typical day, and so I think sometimes we see, ebbs and flows in student activity on campus. So I think during, finals week, for example, it's more of a all hands on deck experience with us where we're helping to proctor exams for several hundred students a day. So that could be kind of a non-typical day where we're all stationed at our testing center and helping, provide services on a day like that. Or two, we have had opportunities for professional development as well. So some of us were able to go to Baltimore this summer for a national conference to help really, learn more about different facets of our field, but also to interface with other accessibility offices. And I think, lastly, understanding kind of the nature of our work. Sometimes emergencies come up where we really need to be able to help with folks with a very immediate or pressing challenge. And that's something too that kind of depending on the day, maybe most of our days is focused on that, but we really want to make sure that we're meeting folks where they're at and helping to provide services also in a timely manner, just because of the nature of the academic setting and how quickly the semester moves. But I think in all of this, we really want to do right by our students, and really helping them, wherever they're at in their educational career.
Thank you for that. Who would you sort of touched on this, but can you elaborate more on some of your key collaborators and how their backgrounds or roles are either similar or different from yours?
Yeah. So within my role in working with our clinical and professional programs, I would say, many of our key collaborators are some of our campus stakeholders. And, within many of our graduate and professional programs, we have really an identified point person who either as the director of a specific academic program or an advisor, or even just someone who's helping with some of the day-to-day administrative operations of an office. We often are really staying in close contact with them to help coordinate services, but also just to check in too. I think when it comes to many of our programs and with accommodations as a whole, we as an office can verify that folks are experiencing difficulty or experiencing a disability related obstacle. But where we're working with our programs and partnership is, we consider many programs to be kind of a subject matter expert in that area. So we're also, seeking to ensure that we're not compromising any learning objectives or standards, that we're still upholding the integrity of academic processes. And so that's where I think as our collaborators, it's really key to be in contact with them, but also I think really making sure that we're aware of any like licensure requirements, accreditation standards, and so having them there is really essential. And I would say too, other offices and key collaborators are faculty. So when a student is approved for an accommodation and generates a letter of accommodation to notify faculty of approved services, that's where, our faculty are really helping us to implement services, make sure accommodations are respected, or, in some cases also interfacing with us to, depending on the requirements of the class, look at how an accommodation is really going to best be implemented to ensure access while, again, maintaining any learning objectives and standards in a course. And then I would say lastly, I think, I might have alluded to this before, but, thinking about our student life partners. So thinking about our Office of Student Conduct, Residence Life, our career center, we're trying, to I would say put on, programs or help with outreach in these areas, understanding that, there are many facets of accessibility that, are unique to those offices. So ensuring access in a conduct process or with the career center, many students are entering the workforce after graduation, and there are, of course, workplace accommodations that students can pursue. So helping with that transition from either undergrad or grad school into a workforce and helping to understand and navigate sometimes very complex conversations around accommodations and job responsibilities. It's been, important for us to maintain those relationships so that kind of we're helping folks from, again, an accommodation lens, but even just after USC, we want to make sure they're equipped with skills to help them in navigating those spaces.
Incredibly helpful. Thank you for that, Alex. What are the biggest challenges in your role, and how have you overcome those challenges, or what strategies are you developing or working on to address them?
Hmm. Yeah. So I think when reflecting on this question, I think the first word that comes to mind is just balance. And, perhaps that is, maybe a common answer, within student affairs and student life. But, I think within our work, we work with many students on campus. I think uh, our last numbers, we were serving close to about, 4,000 or more students on campus. So that's about, 9 to 10% of the university population. And I think from, my own perspective, I'm really, invested in the growth and development of the students I work with. And so something that is sometimes difficult is, making sure that, we can follow up with students, even if that's just to check in, see how the semester is going, and making sure that, students are aware that there's folks here who are, invested in their growth as a student, but also just, their continued well-being and, even just accessing our resources. So I think that can be a challenge just in terms of there's not enough hours in the day to um, not only meet with folks, but also do advanced outreach to, do proactive, partnerships with either campus life offices or faculty. So I think in maybe this is something that's applicable to most work, but creating space for many of these, I would say, endeavors that we think would boost our profile on campus, but also just making sure that we can support folks overall. Um, and I think just, personally for me, I think something when I was first entering this work, especially after graduate school, was being very intentional about making space for myself after work. So, um, even just when many of us were remote for a period of time, it was creating like a buffer in my day, and creating habits, whether that's, cooking, going to the gym, spending time with my partner, things that would, again, help to create, a space outside of work to disengage and to focus on myself. So that, in future days or future weeks that I'm, continuing to bring my best self to the work. And so I think, within each role, I've, really tried to have these conversations too with my supervisor to make sure that they're aware of any challenges in the work, but also kind of what habits I'm trying to foster to again make sure that I'm being present in the work and that we're persisting. I think that's something that we in terms of a student support office, we want to make sure that we're showing up in a way that's really conducive and helpful for the success of our students. So kind of those are the immediate challenges that come to mind, just in terms of balancing everything and again making sure that we're checking in on ourselves and creating those supports within an office to make sure that we feel well supported.
That's applicable to, many of us, so I really appreciate that. We have a question from the audience. Do you ever experience pushback from faculty or departments regarding policies or accommodations? And if so, how do you approach it?
Mhm. Yeah, this is a really great question, and I think with our work with faculty and departments, we have, or at least when I stepped into my role, there were many, I would say, already existing partnerships and relationships with faculty and departments. And I think key in those relationships is also looking at too, how long folks have been at the institution, how long they've been serving in those roles, and also understanding the culture of a department. Where I think within certain schools and programs, we see different standards. So, just thinking about some of our health and medical programs where folks are entering careers where they might be expected to be spending more than 8 hours on a traditional workday if they're in a clinical setting, or it might be a very like high stress job. But when it comes to, I would say, specific policies or accommodations, we really look first at some of the programmatic standards and policies. So it could sound a little bit administrative in nature, but when our office, when we're looking at an accommodation, we're looking at a policy, and if there is anything that's necessarily inaccessible about that. Um, and so I think within departments or faculty, sometimes there can be, I would say, pushback in terms of an accommodation. But I think that really, invites a dialogue for us to really engage, in a conversation about it and kind of weigh that with the learning objectives or standards of a program. So I'll give the example that, if a faculty member or program were to say, we've never provided this accommodation, so, we don't think this would be feasible. Um, you know, with that argument, that's not typically something that we can just say, because this has never been done before, we can't implement it. We're kind of going back to the drawing board and saying, we understand if this hasn't been, done before, but we want to make sure that we're really doing our due diligence to explore if there's necessarily like a barrier here that can be addressed again without sacrificing a programmatic standard or lowering a learning objective. So a lot of it, I would say, is sometimes in working to forge strong partnerships with folks and really making sure they're aware of why we exist as an office on campus, what our mission and vision is. And then oftentimes, too, if we're recommending an accommodation to that's going through a very thorough and diligent review process where, we're exploring are there other supports here that can better address a barrier. And if we're determining as an office that, we think this is the best and most efficient way to address someone's challenges, um, we want to be able to take that to the program and engage with them on that. So I would say it's a lot of balance in terms of our partnerships, educating on our office's, overall mission, and sometimes even bringing in kind of legal policies and sometimes even benchmarking and looking at other institutions who might have, adopted a similar policy. So that kind of goes back to what I mentioned with professional development of staying connected across many campuses and offices. I think that can really be a game changer in terms of looking at how other offices have adopted accessible policies and seeing what can be done here.
Thank you. How do challenges related to equity, power, and privilege manifest in your work? You sort of touched on that, but can you elaborate more on that?
hmm Yeah. So I think all of these things are very inextricably linked within our service area. And I think a lot of this can start when, folks are, entering school for the first time and looking at what resources are available, even for folks at a young age or even as they're progressing in K through 12 or college. So thinking about, I'm, starting out in a specific school district, thinking about the resources, from like a counselor perspective and from a teaching perspective, if folks are able to identify that a student is encountering more difficulties or challenges. And that's often where potentially in the case of like a learning disability, that might be identified at an early age and caught. And then also looking at some of the resources that folks may have, whether that's tutoring resources, if that's specialized support in a classroom with a teaching aid, and thinking about a student who may have access to those things from a very young age, whereas for another student, if they may not have had that, growing up, or it might not have been caught, thinking about some of like the achievement gap that might exist there. So I think when it comes to resources within higher education, and I think something where this comes up is just within a school's like documentation standards. So looking at USC, for example, or really for any accessibility office, there's usually some kind of documentation standard for folks. That can be dependent on a lot of factors. If folks have had prior access to health insurance, if folks have gotten support in an earlier time, and then two, outside of documentation, even just stigma that folks have encountered, whether that's in academic settings, if that's within a familial setting, if that's between friends, there can be a lot of, I would say, larger social factors that paint a certain picture around disability and what it means to request accommodations in a college setting. And so there can be a lot of, I would say, experiences there that can create certain inequities within, our field. And I think, as an office, we try to adapt, policies or practices that try to really eliminate those barriers or create access in terms of resources, especially for those students who may not have had access to those resources before coming to USC, or may not have even been aware that they were encountering a disability-related obstacle. They might have identified it as just something that they had to develop coping skills for, or other resources to support. So um, I would say there's a lot of pieces here that are embedded in, both from like a policy perspective, but also really from a social perspective. And that's I would say I haven't even gotten too into the weeds with kind of how that looks when we're interfacing at a university level, where I think there's definitely certainly a power differential in terms of, a student and faculty member, as well as, a student and, an office such as ours, where we are often, trying to step in to help in mitigating that power differential and acting as, a support for students who are especially encountering some of those barriers in a college setting.
Great, thank you, Alex. A few more questions from the audience. What are some helpful tools and resources for accessibility that institutions can utilize now for more equitable practices, specifically in the classroom and as an administrator?
Mhm. Yeah, so when thinking about just broader inclusion for institutions and how I think especially campus partners or administrators can help with this, some of this is in thinking about it's a concept called universal design for learning principles. So, or it might be abbreviated as UDL. So, in a classroom setting, this might look like really. Looking broadly at the ways in which folks are interfacing with a classroom experience. So even just thinking about a lecture hall, just from like a sensory perspective, how are folks engaging with content that's being presented either in a verbal way or also even just in a visual way? So if an instructor, for example, is presenting with slides, is that information, is that accessible, from, looking at the slides, is the professor sharing this content with students, and really thinking, not only from an accessibility perspective, but just recognizing that at an institution like USC, there's many diverse learners here. So folks can really engage with that content in various ways, and folks are going to have individual preferences to the ways they best engage and then retain that information. So from like a classroom perspective, and thinking about when students leave the classroom, for example, is there a way to, right, still access or have equitable access to the information that was being presented in class? So our notes shared widely are, if a video is being shown in class, is that something that's accessible to folks later? So especially if folks are having maybe challenges engaging in that setting, it provides then an opportunity for folks to engage in another setting. I think too, just from an administrative perspective, thinking about, spaces such as, meetings for folks if there's an agenda or if there's important points being gone over. Again, thinking about how is each person individually engaging with this content that's being gone over, and is this being presented in a way that is, engaging, but also is it accessible to folks? So I think just keeping those things in mind from an administrative perspective, and that can apply to, a variety of different settings. If that's, if a faculty member's, for example, presenting an exam and they say you have 24 hours to complete this, but the exam, say, might take only 1 to 2 hours, that is in a way eliminating an accessibility barrier because it's allowing folks, more time, if they needed more time on that exam to work on it over that 24 hours. So I think with each program and each faculty, we, share that those faculty and programs are, individually responsible for, implementing those, uh, policies and practices within their classroom. So again, it can all really depend on a variety of factors there. But I think when possible, we encourage folks to really think about, again, thinking about your student body and how you're engaging with the classroom. How are we creating an inviting space for students, and how then are we also creating access in that space?
Thank you. And a follow-up question, how can we as staff combat stigma?
Mhm. Yeah, this is a really great question. Um, I would say, within different settings, and I think thinking broadly about how stigma can present in different settings. So I think something I frequently hear from folks is that sometimes there was a fear in seeking out services, or kind of also a perhaps like a culture of like overworking in their specific academic program, where they felt like they just had to push through. And I think with combating stigma, some of that really starts foundationally with thinking about how we're prioritizing and centering well-being within our student populations, and looking to at policies, or just practices that are perhaps widely accepted, from a student lens, feeling like I have to take 18 to 20 units every semester, or else I'm not going to make, this goal, or achieve this thing. And thinking about kind of what narrative that creates for a student who necessarily, because of their disabilities or because of their current circumstances, can't quite manage that, or they can, but it's at the sacrifice of their well-being. Um, and so I think, some of that can look more on like a micro level, like encouraging folks to, reach out for support. Really, I would say demystifying services and recognizing that there is a large body of students on campus who are receiving some kind of academic accommodations, or who have interfaced with our office at one point during their academic career, and really recognizing that that is a right that they have as a student, that it's not something where they're taking advantage of the system, that it is something that we encourage folks to utilize, and actually see within our populations that um, we actually see that, we estimate that there's many more students who qualify for these services than who actually utilize them on campus. And some of that can be related to stigma. And I would say lastly, some of that is just, within our powers as a campus administrator, or, within our individual roles. Some of that can look like disrupting a space, if we're noticing that, something is said that seems to potentially perpetuate a unfair notion about students with disabilities, or that it's creating some kind of advantage. Some of that work that we can do is around like re-educating folks, and kind of being a disruptor in that space, and thinking about how we're using our power in conversations with faculty, with our program administration, and again, kind of how we can, really better help our students in that. I think even when folks are not necessarily in a room, or if it's a closed door conversation, I think it's all the more important for us to stand up and speak on those things.
Very insightful. I'm learning so much myself, so thank you for that. Another question from the audience. Does your office also work on accommodations for staff and faculty?
Yeah, so I would say that's more the responsibility of our sister office. So we have, within accessibility services on the campus, there's the Office of Student Accessibility Services, which primarily is in service of students in degree or credit-bearing programs that are, going towards some kind of academic degree or certification. For our staff and faculty, that's managed primarily by our Office of Institutional Accessibility. And so, similar to our team, they have a team of coordinators who are helping to coordinate services, kind of depending on the department, or academic unit that a faculty or staff member is in. But we often refer folks to them just because that is more related from like a human resources perspective, looking more at folks' core job responsibilities, and understanding any potential barriers that folks are encountering with those. There are times when we might collaborate with their office, and those are often in circumstances when folks are both a student and a staff member. So we see this a lot in some of our doctoral programs, where students might be doing university research, or alternatively might be, doing teaching, for example, for a class where part of the stipend they're receiving is also going towards, their education. So that's often a unique space where, from OSAS, we're trying to better address and help with any accessibility barriers with, the academic setting. But then the Office of Institutional Accessibility is understanding if there's barriers with the work setting and working with departments with that.
Thank you for that. What kinds of skill sets or trainings do individuals need in order to serve in a role like yours?
Mhm. Yeah. So I think something about our work is that, much of our work, I think, is very teachable in terms of making folks, aware of different, policies and practices that govern university disability services. I would say there are some skills that I think are very transferable to the field. And so my background is in, student affairs and higher education. And of, the classes that I took, I would say some of them that were really foundational to my practice were in learning, counseling skills. So especially when speaking with a student or a faculty member, being able to, ask guided questions and learn more, about them, but also being able to really reflect back what you're hearing and really make sure that there's a shared understanding there that folks understand that you're hearing them. And two, I think, because of the nature of our work, sometimes we can be navigating really, I would say, precarious or sometimes very emotionally charged conversations. And so some of those counseling skills in terms of being able to name what emotions folks are feeling, or being able to engage in more de-escalation techniques are really, I think, central and really foundational in work like this. Um, and then two, I think, just from a student development lens, within our work, we're sometimes interfacing with folks who it's their first time moving away from home, or being far from family or being far from like a support system, and just thinking from a holistic approach, what types of support groups do students have access to on campus? How is this, affecting their development and even just their independence in college, and really helping to guide folks along that journey. I think understanding that can really help you just overall in meeting a student where they're at and really forming a genuine connection there. And also being attuned to some of the, even outside of OSAS, some of the supports and services. Um, I would say lastly, if folks are interested in learning more just about, accessibility, I know when I was, first going into this field, much of, my supervisor's advisement was in recommending, books on just experiences for folks with disabilities, not only in higher education, but just in different settings, just to, just think about some of the different approaches to our field and looking at things more from a social lens, understanding how potentially the environment is creating a barrier for folks. And so I think if folks are, interested more in like, reading that they can do at home, if that's just about the history of disability studies or the disability rights movement, even though that's not necessarily, work that we're citing on a day-to-day basis, I think it can inform so much of conversations and your lens to the work and can really show up again, just in the ways that we show up for students and interface with them.
That was a perfect segue to my next question, which are what are some resources, organizations, or associates that have helped you grow and continue learning in your role in industry?
Yeah. So when I first joined this field, one of the organizations that I joined was the Association on Higher Education and Disability. So it's called AHEAD as an acronym. And this was this is a national organization, perhaps probably the largest within our field, and is, I would say, a great space, not only if folks are interested in going to conferences or really engaging with folks in, different cities, across the country, But they also have a great online and virtual community too, where they have different communities that meet on a monthly basis, depending if folks have, particular interest in a functional area within disability services, or even if they're just looking for advisement for a complex student case or new laws that have been introduced. I think there are so many folks who are part of this community who are really eager to step in and help out and also coach new professionals as they're navigating a field. I think within our field in particular, at USC, we're very lucky to have, such strong supports in our office and I would say a structure that really, supports us. But, some campuses too are, maybe newer or their offices have, fewer resources or even just a different student population. And so I think having an organization where you can reach out to folks who are in similar scenarios is really helpful for growing in that field. Um, and then another I would say too is NASPA as well. That was a organization that I was a part of, and within that they had a disability knowledge community. And so that was also a space that when I was in graduate school, I was able to interface with some other graduate students with similar interests and also get some preliminary experience just with being on their executive board and when I was entering the job market being able to market that as an experience that even prior to entering a full-time role in the field per se, I was able to kind of again interface and live in that setting and learn the language. And I think that helped in creating bridges when I was meeting new professionals in the field.
Great, thank you. We have a question from the audience. Do you or your colleagues ever use the term differently labeled rather than disabled? I've heard it before at my community college in an effort to change the connotation around the word disability.
Mhm. Yeah, this is a great question. And I think to provide some context, here as well. I know when and this was actually back in a prior experience of mine, we were, facilitating a conversation around, disability, and instead of calling, the section talk around disability per se, we were more focused on talking about it more as, abilities and putting more of that on necessarily the environment per se and how it creates barriers for folks. Um, I think with the connotation of differently abled, I think how folks identify, I would say, is a very personal decision. So, I certainly have colleagues and I would say too have worked with students who use disability first language. So, for example, saying I'm a deaf person or I'm an autistic person, as opposed to person with deafness or a person with autism. And so that could be a point of disability pride for some individuals. Whereas some folks may identify as a person with a disability, or some folks may use other monikers, such as saying, I'm differently abled, or any monikers that don't necessarily center that point around disability per se. Um, and I think depending on who you ask, there's different opinions on the topic. I think I've heard of some colleagues in the field who don't want to shy away from the term disability, and want to make sure that if we're shying away necessarily that um, that folks are still recognizing that this is still a condition that disables them and that can have real life implications in their day-to-day lives. And so sometimes I think too, it's also thinking about who is, created this moniker? Is it something that is coming from folks with disabilities, or is it something that's coming more from like a dominant culture that maybe is shying away from using the term disability because it's seen as like a point of shame for folks? So I think what I'm coming back to with that is that um, I think it's a very individual choice, and that when I'm having individual conversations with folks, I kind of leave that decision up to them in terms of how they want to identify. We have folks who might be experiencing a very disabling condition, but still prefer not to identify it as such. And we still have our obligation to promote accessibility, to provide resources, but I think how folks want to identify, I try to leave that up to them.
Thank you. Very helpful and insightful. We have just a few more moments. I have two more questions. If no one else has a question, I'll go ahead and ask it. What's one piece of advice that you'd wish someone would have shared with you before taking on this position? Do you have recommendations, or what recommendations do you have for students who are graduating and interested in entering this field?
Yeah, I would say in my experience, I think something that a colleague shared with me is that the work will always be there. So, making sure that, within your chosen field that you're seeking to find ways to prioritize yourself and the work. And kind of going back to what I said before, being able to show up for ourselves in this work, which I think will really help us in showing up for students more broadly, and helping to really create that positive culture on campus. I think we and something that I've learned in this field is that I want to model that for students, especially those students who might be in a program or in a culture that is very much about overworking or pushing as hard or as much as we possibly can. And I think for folks who are interested in this field, for me, I found this field to be incredibly rewarding. And I think something I love about this work is that, every week is very different, and we have the opportunity to meet and interface with so many people across campus, but also people from so many different walks of life. Um, I think for me, something that I recommend to folks, and if they're, job searching right now, is, when you're looking at a campus, if that's USC, or if that's another campus, if you're looking to move cities or states, that you're being cognizant too of just the culture around accessibility on that campus. Really hearing from students about not only an office like ours, but also just thinking about the culture around advocacy on campus. Faculty culture for creating accessible spaces. I think I hear from many students I work with that. A past school that they attended, or an experience in community college or four-year, was really foundational for them because of how accessible it was, or how their staff helped them to really prioritize their well-being. So those are the things that I recommend that folks look at, beyond just the school and the resources, and some of the things that you can piece together from an interview about an office, but also just thinking more broadly about is this a culture that I would thrive in, and do I have the supervision and the supports necessary to grow and develop in this current place.
Thank you so much, Alex. We are just about it. My last question is, do you anticipate having any open positions in your department that you would be willing to share, whether now or in the future?
Mhm. Yeah, so I'm not aware of any open positions that we have right now. I would say that, as folks, folks are getting closer to graduation or are looking, something I did as a grad student in my last semester was just looking at the USC jobs page and, looking in the area, I think, within our office and something, we've seen is that some folks might start out maybe as an exam coordinator or kind of getting their feet wet, so to speak, in the field, and then moving up from there. But it is something that throughout the year, I wouldn't say there's any predictability to when jobs are posted, but just keeping that monitored. We like to share roles on LinkedIn whenever we can. So if that's something that's of interest, folks feel free to reach out to me directly or our office, and we can make folks aware if there's anything that's open or available for folks to apply to.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. That concludes our event for today. I want to just do one more plug. Our upcoming events, we have three more this October, this month, deep dive in first gen centers, as well as two more events. So highly recommend that you check it out. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. This was so insightful, very much appreciated. And we look forward to hopefully collaborating again in the future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time and thank you all for the great questions. I appreciate it.